Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book to screen adaptations. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I am excited because today's episode, I'm going to be talking all about the BookCon interview that Jacob Tierney and Reid gave in New York City, and my commentary on it. I listened to the YouTube presentation that they very kindly put online for everyone who could not attend, and took some notes about what they talked about in regards to making the show, writing the book Unrivaled, and also what they talked about in regards to season 2, because I think everybody is anxiously awaiting any news regarding season 2, myself included, some speculation about what we can expect, and Jacob had a few interesting tidbits that I wanted to elaborate upon and open up a discussion about. So if you are interested in chatting about any of these topics in the comments, please feel free to leave a comment. I always love hearing people chime in and give their 2 cents on season 2, what we can expect, the writing for the show, how they might film certain things, and speculating is fun as we wait for the second season to come out. I thought that the answers and responses during the conversation were really fascinating and insightful, and I really enjoyed it. So that's what we're going to talk about today because I wanted to. So interestingly, this is Jacob and Rachel's first public conversation since the show aired, which I think is crazy. I don't know about everybody else, but it's almost like time feels like a construct to me since the show aired in November. I both can't believe it's been that long, and it feels like it came out yesterday to me. So the fact that this is their first public conversation since November when the show came out is crazy, and I'm happy that they were able to do that because I feel like it's very rare, or hopefully it's going to become less rare, I should say, that an author has this much participation in the launch of the show and also visibility because of the show. I think it's really special that Rachel has been looped into so many of these conversations about the show, and that Jacob and her clearly have a very good friendship between the two of them where they're collaborative with one another constantly, and we can see that the two of them are continuing that relationship as Jacob is writing for season 2 and Rachel is writing the next book in the series. And I think that's really special that the two of them are able to kind of go through this craziness in tandem with one another and enjoy it together. And most of the time, I think the author in a situation like this is very much in the background. Most of the hype and conversation is around the actors and the people involved in the TV show, since the visual piece is, I think, easier for a lot of people to grab onto, whereas reading a book, it's more time consuming and not everybody's going to envision everything the same. So there's less, I would argue, conversation about a book out in the open versus a show where you can talk about gifts and people can do screen grabs and you can rewatch clips of scenes. It's just easier for a show to go viral versus text in a book. But Rachel has been riding this wave as well. And a lot of her commentary, I think, kind of echoes that in this conversation that she had. And she had said that the two of them have read the books probably 6 or 7 times each. I would imagine as Jacob is writing scripts, he's continuing to read over them quite heavily just to make sure he's pulling things out of the source material that he wants to keep true to the source material. But they also talked about how they consult with one another about timeline discrepancies and when things happen and how things happen. And they refer to the books quite often or correct each other when they're trying to make sure that there's continuity going on in both mediums that they're writing in. So I think that's really cool. Rachel also was really excited when they talked about the new book that Jacob is releasing in October that will include scripts and never before seen photographs and annotations from his writing. And she's been saying all the way through the promotional period that the scripts were really awesome for her to read, and she was deeply invested in the story being told by Jacob once she was able to get her hands on them. And all the actors involved said the same thing, that when they were auditioning, they noticed that the script was really special. And so for people who are a fan of reading scripts and screenplays, I think that that book is going to be really great. I'm sure people will buy it strictly just to look at the photographs and everything, but I'm really curious about the annotations as well, and the ability to compare how it was written in the script versus how the actors shot it. And we can hopefully kind of pinpoint some of those creative decisions that Jacob was referring to in this conversation later on. It's actually a question that Hudson Williams had posed to him about how much the story can change from the script to shooting it to editing it, and what the final product is in comparison to where all the people involved in the show are basing it off of in the original script. So I'm really excited about that. I'll probably be pre-ordering that book, and I think it'll be another great opportunity for people who are interested in storytelling in this fashion to break it down and see how he works and how he writes, and then also how everybody interpreted it on the day. Rachel talked about how she knew she had wanted to be a writer since she was a little kid, but she didn't think that that was going to happen, and she started writing when her kids were young. It's crazy to think about that. I think it's a great message to send to people who are aspiring authors. I'm one of those people. I'm still working on writing my first novel, and it's a labor of love, and it's very time consuming, and you question yourself so many times as to whether or not you even have that innate ability to write a good story within you. And I think that her message about just doing it because she wanted to and for the love of it is really inspiring, and you never know where it could lead. And her life has been completely changed by her taking the time to put pen to paper or, type out on her computer and build upon an idea that she had in her head. And originally Game Changer was supposed to be a standalone, and then she had a separate idea for Heated Rivalry. Her pointing out that her publisher is the one that suggested the book be written as a series is really important, because I think that, again, reminds everybody, if you're looking to get into writing, that it's very collaborative. Initially, it can be very isolating when you're writing alone, but eventually, if you let people in to, read it or have ARC readers, involve publishers, it can become way more collaborative in that way. And I think that's really cool that she touched upon it too. And I also liked that she talked about how when she started to write Tough Guy, that's when she realized that this series could just keep going. As Ilya made more and more appearances, she knew that his character was really, really powerful and could easily take over a scene or an entire book if she wasn't careful. And I think that that's so true. You can tell that in Role Model in particular, I find that the moments where Ilya pops up are very much a highlight, and it does sort of take over the story. You want more of him. He's just that alluring of a character. And then she also talked about Role Model and how that was her best opportunity to use Ilya a lot for the first time in a book outside of his own. Role Model, I would say, after Heated Rivalry and The Long Game, is my next favorite book in the series, probably for that reason. But I also think Troy and Harris particularly Troy, is a really well-written, constructed character, and I can't wait for Jacob to get his hands on him, because he mentioned in this conversation that he's really going to dive further into Troy. That's something that I genuinely am really excited to see in season 2. Jacob also pointed out that Rachel's humor and her wit is very evident in the way she writes Ilya. His character is definitely a conduit for her to showcase her humor. Jacob pointed out that he's very partial to humor in his own work. He'll never cut a joke for a show if the actors can make him laugh. And I think that Ilya in season 1, he did have a few comical moments. I'm really starting to think that Jacob's going to lean heavily into him having more, especially since he's going to be interacting with other characters more often in season 2. So we'll have plenty of opportunities for him to be joking with Hayden, and also with Harris, and also with Troy, obviously, and then naturally with Shane. So I think that will be fun, because Ilya in particular is going to have such a wide array of emotions to go through and cover, and his behaviors are going to be so widely spread, he can be hilarious, and he's also going to be deeply, deeply depressed. So there's going to be lots for Connor's story in particular to dive into by way of his character too. They also covered, again, how Jacob followed Rachel back in 2023, sent her a DM, and she had just found out about her own diagnosis with her health, and the two of them had a Zoom call shortly after the DMs. Jacob points out that he was actually shooting another project at the time, and he had read an article about hockey romance as a genre and was worried that someone else would option Rachel's books. So he jumped on the opportunity as quickly as he could. And Rachel almost immediately could tell that Jacob's passion for the story was there, and he really wanted to take it seriously and make it come to life in the way that I think Rachel had always hoped that it would be. So she never had any hesitation about letting him be the one to spearhead this project, nor did she say she felt like she had any hesitation about it actually coming to fruition. And what I really love to hear Jacob say is that it was insane to him how quickly this show actually came to be. He said it happened within 3 years' time. That's really, really rare. I don't think people, if you're not familiar with the industry, understand just how long it can take for a project to get off the ground. And Jacob pointing that out, I think, is really important, especially as people start to get impatient about the turnaround time for them to film and shoot and write season 2. This is very breakneck pace. And Jacob pointed out that all throughout the process, with everybody involved, which is hundreds and hundreds of people, instead of things getting slowed down, everyone involved actually sped it up. And it really reinforces to me just how much of a lightning in a bottle the creation of this show is, on top of just the magic of the show itself. The fact that it got made in this fashion and that everyone involved sped up the timeline for it, even moved up the premiere date, is just crazy. It doesn't happen that way. He says that everything about the way the show was made the creators feel like they were playing catch up, given the speed of things. And we know that to be true because they were still editing the show all the way up until it aired. And Jacob was saying that episode 6 was only completed 11 days before it aired on HBO. So again, I think this is a given, but the fact that we're going to have it filmed, season 2 filmed this summer, is also insane, because Jacob had to write an entire script prior to being able to even schedule things and get these people who are involved in the show onto a schedule. It's so insane that we're getting the turnaround this quickly. And I think that everybody is so used to things being instant and the turnaround time shrinking and shrinking and shrinking that they forget that good quality things take time. And yes, we're going to get a product very quickly considering, but we should be thankful for that because it's very, very rare. Rachel also said that she saw rough cuts of the show back in September, October. And again, the show premiered in November, so that's insane. The show was picture locked in late September, which means that there's no VFX, music, anything added to it, but the frame by frame and scene by scene, that's all finalized. And the show was sold in mid-October to HBO. And then it premiered in November, which is crazy because originally it was supposed to air in February in tandem with the Winter Olympics. And I think that if they did roll it out in that timeline, the reception would have been very different because everyone was home for the holidays and everybody was absolutely obsessed going into Christmas time, watching the slow drip release on HBO, which again, I think is brilliant because having the show air one episode at a time means that all of us collectively could converse about what happened in that episode for 7 days before the next one dropped, and that gets conversation and buzz going around a show. For what it's worth, HBO's model has been successful. I think the best example of that was back when Game of Thrones was in its heyday and how everyone was talking about the episode the entire week in between the drops. And that creates a buzz that you can't replicate in many other ways now with streaming services. Jacob pointed out too that HBO didn't really even know what they bought because the product they saw was so raw and unfinished, but they had such faith in the product that they didn't care. And I think that again is just really, really incredible to hear that the show was made in this way because it doesn't happen that way anymore with streaming products and shows like this. They also had a few questions from fans, and the first one was from Connor, who had sent a voice note with a question to ask them. He sent two. So the first one for Jacob was, what was it about Rachel's writing and storytelling that made it easy for him to connect and then execute making a TV show out of it? And for Rachel, he asked what it was about Jacob that was successful at bringing the story off the page and building it out into a physical world. I think the answers are pretty much covered in multiple interviews that the two of them have given, but they reiterated again, Rachel knew that Jacob was an excellent filmmaker. He's also very funny. I think the two of them have their humor in common. And so I think she trusted that the way she wrote the humor in these books was going to get translated properly and included in the story. But she said that in their Zoom call, it was clear to her how much he understood the characters and that he wanted to tell a story that leaned heavily into the source material and didn't water down the text at all, because this is, after all, a smutty book, and he didn't want to shy away from that. He wanted to lean into it. And he also made it clear that the goal of everything was to celebrate queer joy, which meant a lot to her. So she never was worried about her characters being in Jacob's care. And then again, when she read the scripts, they were amazing. So she knew that no matter what he churned out, the writing was there, the solid writing was there. And all he had to do was find the right people to be the characters. And as we know, they certainly did. Jacob said he knew he loved the books and he wanted to cover a story about queer joy, but also he joked that he wanted to make something horny. He pointed out that for him, he doesn't understand how recently in art, sex is divorced from the art, or that the current trend right now is for the sex that we do see on screen to often be violent or unpleasant or non-consensual. And for him, that doesn't make him feel joy. He really wanted to revive that conversation about how sex can be joyful, particularly queer love and sex. And he also loved that Heated Rivalry used sex to tell the story. He could tell that it was the architect of this relationship that took place over the course of 10 years. And it's when the characters are their most honest and vulnerable. He said that as he's writing season 2, he knows that the overarching theme of Shane and Ilya's story is the emotion between the two of them. And the traditional storytelling beats still matter, of course, and he uses them. But to him, it's not as important as the feelings that you're left with as a viewer or a reader when you're thinking about their relationship in general. I loved his conversation about how the story of Heated Rivalry was written in a way where it's almost as though we are reading the characters' memories of these very specific moments in their lives and these huge events. And I kind of felt that way when I read it the first time too, but it's especially clear in the show because we spend every scene with one or both of these characters, and it's basically taking the largest moment in that day of their life and highlighting it. So these huge life events are told through Shane or Ilya and what they were doing, both separately or together. And every single time it revolves around the other person. So their memories of each other and with each other are what is used to convey their story. And the sex is a powerful part of that. And Jacob had promised Rachel that he would take that seriously because romance is often watered down or dulled down. And he really wanted to make an effort to dig deeper into what Rachel had created, because underneath the fluff, there are two very real and understandable characters in Shane and Ilya. And he also pointed out later on that Troy falls under that camp too. And he wanted to dig deeper into them. And I think that that's evidenced by how he included more scenes that were original to the story and built out the world in a very realistic way that heightens the characters even further. The next question that they talked about was when they decided to include just Shane and Ilya as the main story of the show and make it about Heated Rivalry and not more of like an overarching story about each of the books in the series. And Jacob said simply he liked Shane and Ilya the best. He discovered the series through those characters. He knew that they already had their own sequel, so their arc is bigger than these other ones. And simply put, their relationship is the one that has the biggest following in this book series. And I think that that's fair for everybody who reads it. They're definitely who the story is about, and everyone else is a supporting character in that overarching storyline. And Rachel confirmed that they are the stars of the series. Jacob made a point to say no shade to Troy Barrett, but to me it's very clear that he really loves Troy's character. And so again, I'm super excited and curious to see what he does with him and how he digs into him further, and if he creates more of an original backstory for him. Because in his book, we kind of jump in at a very specific moment in his life, and we get little hints about what his life was like before we meet him at that point. And I think Jacob does an excellent job of building out a backstory and including it in really smart and effective, simple scenes that heighten further behaviors and big moments that character goes through further on. They also asked when Jacob told Rachel that he was going to include Game Changer in the show, which is referring to the standalone episode 3. And he said right away, and he told her that on his first Zoom call. So again, this reiterates that he truly had given this so much thought about how he would have brought these books to life. And that must be so validating as an author to have someone come to you with this fully actualized concept and be so enthusiastic about it. He always knew that Game Changer was going to be a part of the show because the story of Scott and Kip is so necessary for the episode 5 that he had envisioned in his head to have the impact he wanted. And so it was always part of his plan to keep that, and also part of his plan to keep Rachel involved throughout the whole storytelling process, because he didn't want to surprise her with any of his decision making. Rachel pointed out that she also didn't want to interfere with his process. She chimes in when she's asked, and for the most part, she trusts Jacob to do his thing and stays out of it. And again, I think that just highlights that they have a really healthy working relationship where they both respect each other's process and capabilities and talents so much. And that's really, really rare. I think that it adds to how successful the show is, because if you don't have that trust between the two of them, I don't know if you have the types of open conversations the two of them must have had behind the scenes in order to strengthen the storytelling. They also talked about how episode 5 is listed as one of the highest rated episodes of TV ever, which I think is still insane. And Jacob was asked how he chooses the music for his projects. And he simply said there's no method. He just picks songs that he likes. Interestingly, he compared it to casting actors, where he said that there are great songs that work for specific moments, but there are also great songs that don't work as well. There are songs that he might not like as much, but they happen to work fantastically in specific moments. So for him, it's all a bit of alchemy. And he said that the one conscious choice he always wanted to use was I'll Believe in Anything in some project. He didn't say only for Heated Rivalry. He said he always wanted to use that song in something. And it's because he likes how the song builds and swoops and crests. And I think that's so true because he uses it in a very particular way in episode 5. But it is a very long song, so he had to write a scene that accommodates to that. And he said, in general, lyrics for him are tricky because he doesn't want the lyrics to be too literal. And that's why he likes French music so much. There is a lot of French music in this show that he uses, which makes sense given the location that they're in. But I also agree with him that a lot of time instrumentals can be more effective because they can evoke a feeling without being so literal about what you're supposed to feel. And for him, the Sunshine lyric in I'll Believe in Anything is a specific thing that he used to really kind of thread multiple scenes together, but also he said crystallize an emotion or an idea of the scene. So the payoff of the lighting being in our eyes as the camera swoops around and knowing that they both deserve sunshine, and then we hear the words about that sunshine coming through in the song at this exact moment in time. It just creates this really emotional buildup that has this huge payoff. And for him, editing and music are where he can aid in the emotional storytelling. So if there's a scene that's meant to evoke a certain emotion, you can add on a song or edit it in a way that really hammers home what you're supposed to feel or emphasizes the feeling. So for him, songs are used very strategically, but he also was pretty candid in saying that he has to like the song and he also has to be able to afford the song because songs are very expensive to add to projects like this. And the other important thing for him is that he doesn't want lyrics to be too on the nose. So I think that if you go over the soundtrack for the series, you can kind of identify which songs are used in those strategic ways. I think the fact that he does montages so well is huge because, again, would they be as effective if the song was different? You want to think about that when you're putting the edit together. And that's all stuff that takes a lot of foresight, but also talent to be able to, in your head, pull together a soundtrack like that. And he also said he listens to a lot of music while he's writing. And then that kind of naturally feeds its way into the storytelling too. So I find that fascinating, especially as someone who typically tends to write to orchestral or instrumental soundtrack music. And he also was listening to Peter when he was writing, and that's who was the composer on this project. So it's all very looped in and very nicely pulled together in that way. They asked Rachel how she felt about seeing the kiss on the ice in episode 5, and then also Shane and Ilya reacting to it. And she said that when she wrote the Scott and Kip kiss, she always felt it would be so great to see it filmed and brought to life, but the way that Jacob cut it and edited it was truly the best thing for her to see. And she knew when she watched the rough cut of that episode that it was incredible, so she wasn't surprised that it was everybody's favorite episode. And again, knowing just how long Jacob had planned that particular scene in his head, and then that's one of the things he's most proud of in all the work he's done, it just makes me so happy to know that the payoff was there. All that effort and his creativity was able to shine in the way that he wanted it to. And now he's being rewarded for that. So I think that's really cool. Jacob also said he was surprised by the fan reaction after episode 1 and 2, because again, those were released in tandem with one another, and it was very intense on his end. And then he said that, again, because it was a weekly drop, after episode 3, the fan reaction became more intense. He kind of lost a gauge of how to anticipate what the fan reaction was going to be week after week. But he knew that episode 5 was coming, and the end of episode 5 was this huge culmination of work that he had poured into this project and would have this really big emotional payoff. And I can only imagine what that would have been like on the back end, knowing what's coming in a few weeks' time and seeing fan reactions and just waiting in the wings to see how crazy everyone's going to go when they watch episode 5 and the ending of episode 5 in particular. And I know for me, I was watching the episode in the middle of the night, and I just had this outer body experience, really marveling over how well constructed it was. It was almost like I had to watch it once to appreciate how it was composed and shot and edited, and then I had to watch it again to really let myself feel the emotions of the characters and appreciate the acting in the scene. It's like both elements of that scene were just so incredibly well done that they both deserved its own moment to celebrate the work behind the scenes, behind the camera, and the work in front of the camera. It was just incredible. The two of them also confirmed that Hudson and Connor had read the books multiple times, and Jacob and Rachel were asked if they talked to them specifically about the language used in romance novels. So how often the characters are described as, their eyes darkened or gazing at their lips, all those different kind of ways of explaining little micro expressions that characters can have. Rachel said she didn't talk to them about the language of romance novels, but more so talked to them about the genre in general, and then they deep dived into the characters themselves. And Jacob, interestingly, said he does not talk to his actors about stuff like that. His notes for them are always on something that they can take and use in their performance in a very granular way. And so he really relied heavily on their chemistry that he knew they had. So he would just tell them, look at him, and then he would use his camera to convey whatever he wanted to capture in that scene. So I'll drift the camera down from your mouth to your eyes is what he is quoted saying in this moment. So again, I think that's such a great insight into how Jacob works and how much he trusts his actors and how he relies so much on their talents and their inputs and what they bring to the table, and how it can add to his storytelling, and that he doesn't have this vice grip on what it's going to look like. He makes it very collaborative. And so he would give them a note like, look at his mouth, follow the water bottle. And Jacob also trusted that their bodies would react naturally to those movements. And I think we see that very effortlessly in this show. It never feels like what they're doing is choreographed, even though we know that some parts of it are heavily choreographed. A lot of what people love about the show are those micro expressions and reactions they have to one another. And now you know that Jacob was really relying on their bodies reacting to each other naturally. And that's so important to hear when you're watching something, because it makes the performances feel really rooted in realism. And because of that, he didn't have to give them too many notes, which I think is very cool. And we know that they shot this so quickly that he didn't overextend. He told them what he wanted. He let them react the way they reacted, and he captured what he captured, and then trusted that that magic was going to be there on the day, and it was. They talked about conversations regarding Shane being autistic, Hudson's portrayal of autism, and how he really tried to hone in on his real life experiences with his own dad to inform some of his decision making as the character. And Rachel said she loved that he associated his father and brought that to his character. And she had tried to write Shane's autism without explicitly saying it in the book, because she doesn't think Shane as a character is aware of it or would be looking into it that heavily. Hudson and Jacob both were able to identify that Shane was autistic right away. For Jacob, he said autism is such a blanket term and it covers so many different behaviors and can manifest in so many different ways that Shane is just Shane. For him, writing Shane and capturing Shane was less about having the autism drive the character and more about understanding Shane as a person and how he would react or behave in certain environments. Jacob also included this little tidbit about Ilya loving to tease Shane because it rattles him so much, and that he really enjoyed that it was cute and funny and flirty, and so he leaned into that. Ilya identifying Shane's behaviors as a human and playing into them because he finds it cute and funny and flirty. And so again, it de-emphasizes the autism. It doesn't make it less important, but it also just makes Shane feel like a fully realized person that is existing with his own unique traits, just like everybody else is in the show. Rachel, Hudson, and Connor had all talked about when they think Shane and Ilya fell in love. And one of my favorite parts of this conversation was Jacob saying that he thinks they fell in love immediately and just didn't know it, because they are obsessed with each other from the jump. That much to him is obvious right away, because they're never not thinking about the other person. And so Jacob feels like they loved each other instantly. I really loved that reflection, because I think that that's so true. And Hudson in particular has said that he had played Shane as though he was in love with Ilya from the beginning. And I think that that's really beautiful, because two things can be true, right? You can be in love with someone and not internally be able to label it as that, but your body is reacting in a way that your brain hasn't caught up with yet. And I think that that really encapsulates what I feel these characters went through. There was just this pull between them that they didn't understand. And you can look back on it when you have had the conversation and now know you're in love, and look at it and say, yeah, I think that's what it was back then. For Jacob, he felt that because of how Rachel wrote the characters and how Connor and Hudson are as actors, he made a point to not talk about it or tell them when he thought that they would fall in love or make it obvious in the show, because to him, he quite frankly didn't care when they decided to label it. It was more like this overarching emotion that they both felt from the jump. So for him, it could be any moment, and none of it changes that their connection was instant from the beginning. And I think that's really cool, because as a viewer, it's fun to think about, okay, when was the moment that they actually fell in love? And everyone can have a different answer to that. And I know in the book, there's a moment when Shane internally in his head admits to himself that he's in love with Ilya. But from the very first chapter of the book, he's having these thoughts about, what is this? How do I identify this feeling? And so it's just fun to think that there's no actual concrete time, and every person can kind of pick a moment where they feel like that might be true for them while reading it as the moment they both fell. I don't know, I think that makes it more interactive as a viewer as well. Piggybacking off that, Jacob said he didn't strategically make the show be almost like a situation where they're rewarded for paying attention. He more so knew that the things that he was talking about and the characters in the show are mainly behavioral. And so they both avoid vulnerability. Their behavior is the way that they tell the story and how they're feeling. And so naturally, as you're watching that, you have to pay attention. And so he simply made the best show he could make. And that meant not assuming that the audience is stupid. And I think the reception of that storytelling tactic has been so well received that I hope more people pay attention to that, because storytelling, yes, is largely dependent on dialogue, and that will always be true. But I think that most of the time when you're dealing with a real life situation, you can infer so much from other people's body language, and shows have started just kind of shy away from relying on that as a vehicle to tell a story, and Jacob leaned into it fully. And I think that that's gonna start a little bit of a revival in that kind of storytelling, hopefully. They started to talk about Ilya and his perception levels. Jacob and Rachel both think that he is extremely perceptive and observant about everyone, and so naturally he's going to notice queer people as well. That's kind of used as a comedic beat throughout all of these books, but Jacob really hammered home that at the core of everything, Ilya's an empath, and so he clocks things in people, yes, but a perfect example for him is that in Ryan, it's not so much about his queerness and that he's gay. It's more that Ryan is struggling with his mental health. And so when he identifies that Ryan is not happy playing hockey, he tells him that he should get out of it. For Jacob, Ryan's crisis is his mental health, not his sexuality. And Ilya is simply clocking that for that person who is struggling with that, he can be helpful to him in some way. And Rachel also doubled down on that by saying that when Ilya showed up at Scott Hunter night, it's because he knows Scott needs support and he wanted to be better than the other guys in the league by being there to support him. It's not entirely dependent upon the fact that Scott is gay. And I think that's really important going into season 2, because there's going to be more examples of that and also more interactions with Troy. And I think most people are going to sort of expect that the thing that binds Ilya and Troy is their shared secrets about their sexuality. But in reality, he identifies Troy's drinking problem and his relationship with his dad first. And I think people forget that. I'm looking forward to Jacob leaning into that. Jacob also noted that one of his favorite lines in The Long Game is when Scott says that he wants to join Shane and Ilya's camp, and Ilya says, "We already have a boring guy." I think that it's safe to assume that a lot of the original dialogue is going to find its way into the show, because most of it did in season 1, and Rachel pointed out how much she really appreciated that he used so much of it, and that a lot of people's favorite lines are sort of a combination between her writing and Jacob's writing. The two of them, I think, having that shared sense of humor really shines there, because it doesn't feel like when you're listening to this show or watching how people converse that you can identify what is Rachel's writing versus Jacob's. They just blend so seamlessly together. For Rachel, she said she really strives to sound natural in dialogue. I think that that's very true, and I think Jacob does a wonderful job with that as well. There are a few lines that he did change for the show, and I think that that's pretty common, especially when you're reading something in your head. It's different than when it's being audibly said out loud. Sometimes a sentence can feel clunky coming out of somebody's mouth, or it's hard for them to say on the day. And so those changes are necessary, but I never felt like there were any that really took away from the storytelling at all. Rachel also said that her favorite adapted scene was the bathroom scene in Vegas, something she has said multiple times. And it's because he took that scene, which originally was kind of just a setup for a sex scene, and he turned it into something that just had so much more emotion, and she described as an incredible piece of art. And again, I'm so curious to see which scenes he takes from The Long Game or Role Model and does the same sort of transformation with, because I think he has so much room to play in that sandbox of those stories and pull something really beautiful out of it. And that's also when he started talking about his co-writer, Mike, who is an old friend of his, and that is helping write the screenplay and the scripts for this show for season 2. A lot of that is because of the time frame getting crunched the way it did for them to turn the show around. But Jacob pointed out that Mike loves the show, loves the books, is coming into the writing with the same enthusiasm and energy as Jacob. And because The Long Game is so long, it's going to feel different inherently from season 1. It also is covering different topics. It's going to be challenging because this is a more serious stage of a real relationship that they have to cover and discuss. And Jacob said that there's more danger and adolescent topics in Heated Rivalry, because so much of what they're going through is the first time they're ever experiencing these things. And that's kind of gone now. They're really settling into what it looks like to be a couple in a relationship that is serious and adult, and the stakes are different. And he described The Long Game as a very emotionally sophisticated book. So that excites me because it is going to treat it as such. If he's defining the book as emotionally sophisticated, I think that we're going to get emotionally sophisticated writing. I think for him too, the fact that role model is happening in tandem with the events of The Long Game means that the way he's writing those characters in is different than doing a standalone in episode 3 where they, go back in time and kind of isolate the Scott and Kip story. This is different. So even though Shane and Ilya are always going to be the heart and center and soul of the show, he pointed out that as their world expands, they're going to remain central to it all, but he does have to include people in a different way than, a standalone episode like episode 3 in season 1. So I'm curious if that means we're going to get a B plot. I really don't think we are, but that's going to be interesting because if we do start getting B plots, that will change the feel and tone of the show. Jacob said that his favorite scene in The Long Game is their big fight at Christmas because it's so smart. So I really kind of am starting to think that maybe that will have a good portion of a full episode to cover that. He also said that having to live in a relationship where they are still not communicating properly despite loving each other so much is such a universally human concept, and that knowing a successful relationship requires more than just loving each other is something that he's so excited to showcase and dive further into. And I really do start to wonder if he's going to dedicate a whole episode covering that moment between the two of them, because I think he easily could, and it's going to hit home with so many people. He also noted that Rachel's writing is, for him, a cut above typical romance books because they're discussing a real relationship and grounding it in reality. He used Troy and Harris as an example of that because on the surface, the trope for them is grumpy sunshine, but to Jacob, Troy is written as a deeply damaged character that he's excited to dig further into in the show because to him, that's more interesting than this sort of surface level grumpy sunshine. The books for him, he finds, are really fertile ground for him to expand upon. And I think he's going to write some really beautiful original scenes and dialogue for Troy in particular. He seems to have a very special spot in his heart for him. And I do too. So I'm looking forward to that. They asked Rachel where Troy and Harris would be 10 years from now. And she said that she's going to expand upon them a lot in Unrivaled, but that book doesn't take place 10 years later. And she felt like their ending was kind of abrupt in their book because she knew that The Long Game was coming. So she does plan to expand upon what happens with them in Unrivaled, which is exciting. They also talked about all of the awards and recognition that the show's been getting. They asked Jacob and Rachel what genre of books they enjoy reading. And Jacob pointed out that he's going to be doing a show about Alexander the Great and covering the book The Golden Mean. Rachel said she reads everything, but when she's writing, she tries to read something outside of the romance genre, so a lot of sci-fi and historical fiction. And then Jacob recommended a book called Human Acts, which I am going to add to my reading list because it sounds fascinating. Then they talked about Hudson's question, and I really loved the conversation about this because Jacob answered it really interestingly by saying there are 3 stages of creation, which includes writing, shooting, and cutting. And you have to let the light in for all 3 stages. For him, a script is a script, but it's not proper until it's read and reacted to. And I loved how he described it as the plans for a building, but not the building itself. And then when you shoot, he is so open to there being surprises from the actors or production where, they might not be able to shoot at a certain location and they have to pivot. And so then that offers a unique change to the story. And then the editing is the same thing. So by the time you get to the end, all these different huge things can happen at every single stage that influence how a project turns out at the ending versus what you plan for at the beginning. And for him, the emphasis is on staying open and allowing surprises and be willing to change and find the best product at the end. And that part of that approach is that he doesn't shoot a lot. So for season 1, there wasn't a lot of extra footage. And he pointed out that there will be a blooper reel, but he doesn't think it's that funny. So I'm excited that we're going to see that at some point. They ended talking about how much change in both their lives there's been since the show came out. Rachel pointed out that authors aren't usually recognized, so she's still surprised and weirded out by that at times, but it's wonderful. Interestingly, she said on a small scale before this, she didn't tell many people what she wrote about or that she was a writer, and now everybody knows that she wrote Heated Rivalry, and she finally doesn't feel weird or embarrassed about that anymore, which I think is such a beautiful sort of side effect of all of this happening for her. Jacob said that even though it's not even been 6 months since the show aired, their lives have all changed so drastically, and they created something they had hoped would be a hit, but could have never predicted that this type of reaction would happen to it, because it doesn't happen. And I think that that's so true and important to point out, that it surprised everybody involved because this is so rare. Jacob had always felt like if he could get 10% of the readers of the books to be as passionate about the show as they are about the book series, that they would be the people that really catapulted it to a new level, and they were. So I think that's really wonderful that they gave props to the people who read the books and sort of created the platform in the first place. They also asked if the pressure and attention has changed how Rachel is approaching writing her next book. And she said that the biggest thing for her is that she doesn't have as much time, especially now that she's promoting and traveling and talking on panels. At this point in time, she's in a place where the whole world cares about what happens, and that's something that she's never written from before. But I think it's really nice that her emphasis is on sticking to what she's always done, which is to write for herself and then just hope that people like it. And I think that that's really a beautiful message to end the conversation on, because if you are an artist in any way, I think that's such an important thing to remember, is that the first person you have to make art for is yourself. And if people like it or don't like it, you have to live with the result. And so doing things for yourself is really important. Lastly, I think it's really important to point out just how great of a job Versha did moderating this panel and conversation. And I felt like the way that she chose to end it was just such a beautiful message that really encapsulates a lot of what I think this show has achieved in its own right and is aiming to achieve globally. I think if you haven't watched the video on YouTube, it would really be of a great benefit to you to go through and read some of the comments in there, because there's a lot of really interesting ones. And I think highlighting the very recent news about Russian media getting fined for publishing a review on the show is just bringing up again how no matter where you are in the world, these topics are still very relevant, and this discussion is ongoing and very important. And I think that the impact of this show is obviously a personal thing for everybody who partakes in reading the books or watching the TV show, but it's also important to recognize that it has a global impact, and that in different parts of the world and in different communities that we all live amongst and within, it will have a different meaning. And the important thing is that it's getting conversations started, and it is injecting media into the world that we need to see. And Versha said it really beautifully when she said that the universe is the world as it should be. And it's a very aspirational viewpoint that we are putting out into the world. And it made me think about how Schitt's Creek did the same thing back when it was coming out. And again, that's another Canadian production. They really tried to tell the story that showed the world as they wish it was in reality, and portray things in the way that they hoped that it would be, really happening in the world, and create an environment that was aspirational. If we want our world to change, we need to show everybody what that looks like and have a goal in mind that we're all, rowing towards together, steering the ship towards together. One of the more understated messages for me of this show is that we don't know what other people are going through 99% of the time. A lot of us keep most of our feelings internally and don't always share them. And for people to be curious about one another and care genuinely about how another person feels and what they're going through, it only benefits everybody. And that's something that I think we can all strive towards. That wraps up my coverage of BookCon and this really beautiful conversation. I felt the 57 minutes flew by. It was so easy to watch, and I'm so glad that they put it onto YouTube so that everyone who couldn't be in attendance at the actual event was able to listen in and hear the really insightful responses from both Jacob and Rachel. As always, thank you so much for listening and getting this far into the podcast episode and for sticking around and hanging out with me. And I will talk to you all in our next chat.